thanks for joining us. You're watching a rather special episode for Malaysia Day. This is Notepad and I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. Considering that we're celebrating Malaysia Day yet again, we want to take stock of the economic conditions of the country and more importantly, how can we move forward from this status that we are at. We are currently straddling between a rich nation versus a developing nation. We are looking at three big territories of the country, Sabah, Sarawak and Semenanjung, or the Peninsula of Malaysia, which has varying degrees of economic growth and development. We're also looking at the budget that's looming ahead of us, so there's plenty to talk about. What better to talk about these things than the country head for the World Bank, Dr. Firas Raad, here to share with us some of the details that the World Bank can share in terms of some economic conditions and indicators for us to understand a little bit better some of the policies that can be made following these type of indicators. Dr. Firas, again, thanks very much for joining us. I want to learn a little bit better about the whole, before we start, deep diving into all these kind of data, let's take a look into where we are as a nation in 2019.
Well, allow me first, Ibrahim, to thank you for having me on the show. And I'd like to also congratulate all Malaysians on the occasion of Malaysia Day. I think it's a great day for this country. And when you look back at what has been achieved over the past 5 decades, it's really been tremendous. A country that has modernized its infrastructure, its economy, its institutions. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country. And for someone like me coming from the Middle East, living and working here, it's really been a breath of fresh air. So congratulations to you, to all Malaysians in this country, and I'm privileged to be here as a World Bank Country Manager. Now looking at where Malaysia is at the moment and where it wants to be, we recently participated in the RMK 12 conference with the Ministry of Economic Affairs, and that exercise looked at what the development priorities should be over the near term, over the next 5 years. But there are also development objectives over the next 10 years. And this is, I think, what Tunem was talking about when he looked at or termed the shared prosperity term and used it to describe the long-term vision of the country. But what we see now is a country that is on the cusp of high income, and within the next 3 to 4 years, we estimate, or even beyond that, that threshold will be crossed. And so this National Development Plan is a special one because it will bear witness to that crossing. But in our view, Malaysia has to up its game in the sense so that all Malaysians feel that they're benefiting from economic prosperity. And we have a couple of agendas that we are supporting, and we think will be important for
There's plenty to pick up from there. We'll touch on the notion that you mentioned just now. Malaysia should up its game. We'll deep dive on that element. But I want to learn a little bit better. What do you think about the Shared Prosperity Program that the Prime Minister has announced recently?
Well, it intersects with our corporate twin goals. So we have 2 corporate goals. One is to eradicate extreme poverty. The other one is to boost shared prosperity. And what we mean by that is boosting the income growth among the bottom 40 of all populations in all countries. So that is something quite important, because as Malaysia transitions to high income, it has to make sure that it addresses the vulnerable groups in society.
There's also a big topic on how do you measure poverty, because apparently nobody can agree to, and some people get disappointed when the measurement of poverty is being rearranged. Can we get past the methodology first before we can tackle poverty, or must we really decide on how do we really measure poverty?
Well, I think the measurement exercise is an important one. And when it was done, originally in the 1970s, it was set at a certain level. As we've argued recently, and others too, we feel that this needs an upgrade at the moment. So it's been 4 or 5 decades where the poverty line was set. And as you know, countries grow, they become richer, expectations evolve. So what was acceptable 4 or 5 decades ago in terms of providing a dignified life for all Malaysian nationals may not be acceptable now. And as we said, it's not for anyone to define.
Has expressed disappointment at that kind of statement coming in from the UN Special Rapporteur, what would be the World Bank's view on the opinion or the statement that was given by the Ministry of Economic Affairs?
Well, as I said, society's evolved, and it's for the governments and the people to decide what is an acceptable poverty line. And right now, the official statistic is 0.4%. And if you adopt a different poverty line, one that is more consistent with Malaysia's income level, naturally that figure would rise. But I think that's only natural. Over 4 or 5 decades, expectations change, and then what is defined as being poor also changes.
Dr. Firas, there's also a conversation of the poverty expectations across the country is actually not as uniformed as one might think. Sabah Sarawak is also facing different levels of poverty from the various states in the Peninsula of Malaysia. Can we take stock into the key elements into what makes a state, I guess, important to look at in terms of economic development? Must there be more focus given to these states that are lagging behind in other states that is perceived to be far ahead in terms of economic prowess?
Yes, for sure. I think that was reflected in the midterm review that the government produced. And if you go back and look at the 6 priorities, so the regional imbalances and addressing those regional imbalances in development was one of those priorities. And we expect in RMK 12 and the next National Development Plan, there would be a similar focus on addressing imbalances across the different states in Malaysia, particularly Sabah and Sarawak, because when you look at their development indicators, when you look at, for example, poverty levels, when you look at wage and salaries, certain indicators related to urbanization, transport, telecom access, to Wi-Fi, broadband services, Sabah and Sarawak lag behind most of the states, not all of the states, but most of the states in the peninsula. So I think there should be a concerted effort that has been reflected in the development plans of this government in the current development plan, and we expect it will be similarly so in the next development plan.
Malaysia as a country is approaching the 60th marker. While Malaysia in itself gained independence in 1957, Malaysia in its true form today, minus Singapore I suppose, came about in 1963. So you can imagine close to 6 decades, we've been talking about this every year or so, about how do we get Sabah and Sarawak in the development growth program along with the rest of the peninsula states in Malaysia. Do you think that this is the shared prosperity notion can be seen as more of a sloganeering effort instead of a real concrete effort to get wealth across the board?
From what we see, it's a serious effort. I think it will be reflected in the National Development Plan, as we are hearing. And the government can do different things to promote greater development, greater growth, and job creation in Sabah and Sarawak. And I think one thing they can think about is leveling the playing field to the extent possible. And so that could be more investment in service delivery, in improving services across the board, in supporting investments in basic infrastructure, in education, and in the energy sector. And there are examples of some of the poor schools, for example. Those are categorized as poor schools. A large proportion of them are in Sabah and Sarawak, and that's an indication that some of the service delivery is a bit uneven, and more can be done. So we are hopeful with more investments in basic infrastructure, service delivery, and then a push to also diversify the economy in Sabah and Sarawak as well. They're heavily reliant on the agricultural sector. More can be done to diversify away from a single tree crop, and more can be done to diversify the end uses of that tree crop, the palm oil that is produced.
One of the reasons why I was actually a little bit excited to get you on board this show is because you come in from a neutral perspective. Everybody else gets charged up when you talk about their own country. I'm pretty sure your own country, when we start talking about, say, politics in your native country, you're going to get a little bit more energized. So from a neutral point of view, from a very objective point of view, do you think that Malaysia has what it takes, not just as necessary ingredients to get it done, but the kind of appetite, the kind of desire to get it done. Because we're looking at the services sector, as you mentioned. Again, this has been going on for at least 2 decades, a conversation of how do we make ourselves a little bit more service-oriented as a country, how do we get ourselves more productive in the services sector, how do we push up our wages in the services sector to be international standards. It's been 2 decades. What is the different, I guess, changing factor to get this really done? Is it change of government? We got that box ticked already. What else can we do?
Well, I'll go back to the high-income transition story. So over the next 12 months, we'll be preparing a report for the government on the high-income transition. And the exact title of the report is something that you have just said, what will it take? And we'll be focusing on different policies. So several of them, I think, will include things like boosting productivity growth and innovation, and making sure that the Malaysians of today really have the skills that are needed to shape economic growth in the right way. So productivity growth and innovation is part of the story. Then human capital and developing human capital in ways that promote productivity growth. So that's investing in better childhood learning outcomes, so STEM education, health as well, and general social protection outcomes. But health is a very important sector, and as you've heard recently, and this was part of our human capital project, we looked at the indicator of stunting across countries around the world, and I was surprised, as others, that stunting amongst Malaysian children is quite high. It's 20% of all
More so
children.
in urban areas.
And well, not so. It's actually, it cuts across all income levels and all geographic areas.
Again, when this report came up, the people kind of figured that out, but the government took aback in terms of the statement, saying that they too were disappointed with these kind of statements. It seems like this government is actually quite surprised at reports coming out and thrown at their feet.
So I would go back to productivity growth, human capital. I'd also say that probably the country needs a new poverty agenda, as we mentioned, a new poverty line or an upgraded one, and then to look at the social assistance program currently in place, BSH, and perhaps deepening the benefits of BSH, and then doing more around health, education, and social protection. And these are the multidimensional aspects of poverty, because it's not enough to deal with the monetary aspects. There are the non-monetary aspects of well-being. And so all Malaysians want to feel that they live in a country in which the services are consistent with a high-income environment.
There's also a conversation of the budget coming across. It's going to happen in just a few weeks from now. We have been described as having a rather austere budget for the past year. It's an austerity movement. We're trying to pay off our debts and so on. Do you think that the time is right for us to relook at how we approach the budget for this year? Is it important for us to look at an expansionary budget where social assistance that you speak of is deepened, and maybe not just deepened, but also opening up the breadth of the social assistance network?
So the government has different policy objectives, and one is to try to make sure that you balance the budget. You finance the deficit and you don't increase the debt too much, and that the debt story has been a big one. You also try to use the budget as an instrument to drive economic growth and to make sure that you are providing the right kinds of incentives to investors and private firms, and to make sure that you are protecting those who need protection. And so the budget can do all of that. Now the government will have to try to build fiscal buffers. This is one recommendation of ours, given the environment that we are living in at the moment. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the external environment because of things related to global trade, the trade tensions that are ongoing between the US and China. Brexit is another story. So we see a lot of uncertainty, and in this climate, I think the government will be well advised to try to build fiscal buffers, but also to use whatever instruments it has in a very effective way to induce greater investment by the private sector.
Right. Another fascinating conversation, but we have to go for a break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit more with the World Bank Country Head, Dr. Firas Raad. Thanks for staying on with us. This is a special episode on the Malaysia Day edition. I have with me the country head of the World Bank, Dr. Firas Raad, here to discuss a little bit better what the opportunities that lie ahead for us to actually get to where we want to be in terms of economic prosperity. Dr. Firas, the conversation is of course always involving why Sabah and Sarawak are always taken a step back in terms of the nation's growth. And I don't want to look back in anger, as Oasis made a song about that, but there is also a conversation where we need to have on the opportunities that lie ahead for us to actually get that shared prosperity, the term that the Prime Minister has mentioned earlier. How do we make sure that the prosperity is indeed shared by the whole 32 million population of Malaysia?
So, as I said again, I think the budget and the national development plans are tools that the government can use to make sure that the resources are flowing in the right way. And so that I think should happen, and then go into things like basic infrastructure, into improving the quality of education and health services, the power sector. We know and we've heard that within Sabah and Sarawak there are disruptions in electricity, and that can have a detrimental effect. And we know that educational outcomes are also quite uneven. So more can be spent, and it can be spent in a better way. There are also other things that could be taken advantage of. We have heard recently of the Indonesian government's decision to possibly locate its new capital on the island of Borneo. So that could possibly, pose an opportunity also for Sabah and Sarawak to.
That's a very important point. In fact, it's nice that you brought it up, because the big cities of Samarinda is actually rather close in terms of proximity to Kota Kinabalu, and of course other cities inside Kalimantan, including that of Balikpapan and Pontianak. Those are closer towards Kuching. Do you see this as a catalyst for us to actually see rapid growth in terms of economic development there on the island of Borneo in the next decade maybe?
Surely, I mean, if the Indonesian government goes ahead with this initiative and the connectivity is there across the island in terms of transport infrastructure, telecommunication and so on, there could be great spillover effects. And so that's something that the Malaysian government can think about from now, and then think with the private sector in Malaysia, specifically in Sabah and Sarawak, what can be done in anticipation of this event. But it could have a great spillover effect.
The issue of employment is also critical. A few weeks ago, the youth minister argued that the employment age, at least for the government service sector, should be increased from 60 to 65. He argues that the youth unemployment rate, his number is 10.7%, far higher than other countries that he himself quoted. This include Singapore, which is roughly about 3%. This is youth unemployment, of course. Germany, about the same figure, low single digits. Of course, the Department of Statistics have a larger number in terms of rate of vacancies. They put here at 2.5% in terms of unemployment, 2.5%, but youth unemployment is a huge significant of it. What can we do to reduce youth unemployment?
So just to go to the figures, generally in all countries, the general unemployment rate is lower than the youth joblessness rate. And so similarly here in Malaysia, we have the same pattern. So a lot of it has to do around this education industry nexus. What is the educational system producing, and is it producing what the market needs here in Malaysia? So the skills gap, and if there is a skills gap, has to be looked at and analyzed. And one thing that we are working on with the Ministry of Human Resources and other agencies as well is what we call a critical occupations list. And it's a tool to look at certain occupations in the economy and to see whether there are shortages or surpluses.
What would be some of the examples of, say, critical occupancies or critical
occupations? It cuts across the high skill, medium skill, low skill. And this tool takes data from different agencies and then collates it. And then so the government can see over periods of time where there are shortages. So that's can be used as an instrument to send signals to the higher education system that we need to maybe do more here because that's where the demand is coming from. But certainly the role of technology is going to shape the labor market in significant ways.
I don't know whether this is an Asian thing, but as a parent, everybody is obsessed about, you know, their child going to university, getting at least a degree, and you know, oh, you can't get a job with a degree, get a master's, you can't get a job, PhD, and become lecturer.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it happens anywhere else, but
yeah.
I mean, that's the joke, right?
Yeah. It's similar in my my home region, my country, Jordan, and the Middle East and North Africa.
Everybody must have.
There's an obsession with the diploma, and it's not, you know, not everything rests on the diploma. So,
you know, high income nations. We're talking about Scandinavia, Australia. We're looking at blue-collar workers earning up to $200 an hour for their services. We're looking at a very, very high maintenance culture. Electricians, plumber, you name it, right? These are kind of the critical areas that are highly paid. And I'm speaking out of experience because my sister, who lives in Australia, literally had to pay $200 for 1 hour for the services of a plumber. Another sister of mine lives in Sweden. She pays 250 crowns an hour just for the services of an electrician. Can we reach that level in terms of sophistication of the requirements of what is needed in the job market? Not just anybody should have a degree.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a big role for the general education system to play, from kindergarten, from KG to 12.
The whole, they say K-12.
Yeah. That whole spectrum. I think a lot of focus should be placed on putting together reforms that support improvements in the learning outcomes. So when you look at science and math, for example, outcomes of 6th graders, 8th graders, 4th graders, and you compare them to other countries that are of similar income levels or higher, Malaysian students do not fare as well. And that's where I think a lot of investment has to go in to make sure that children in Malaysia from grade to grade are learning what they're supposed to be learning, because then that will shape their ability to adopt the skills that they will need to then promote the digital economy. Because the digital economy is here, the digital revolution, and to the extent that youth in Malaysia are able to embrace that challenge, the better the country will be and more competitive it will be.
If I'm the finance minister and I hear you speak for the past 20 minutes, I get a little bit nervous. There will be heart palpitations. Why? Because you have mentioned that there will be at least 3 areas that Malaysia really needs to spend a lot on. Number 1, healthcare. Number 2, a way to look into poverty. Number 3, education. And again, this is something that we have been debating year in, year out. How do you think the public, the Malaysian population at large, can actually influence this government into really focusing into these areas where we know that education is critical, not just for the development of the country in the next 10 decades, but today as well? Healthcare, we all know that health inflation as a segment is the highest in terms of inflation rate per segment. All these is critical, but how do we, watching this show at home, tell our government, tell our members of parliament, this is what is needed to be done. We need to get them to do this. How do we do that?
Well, it's not all about spending more, Ibrahim. It's sometimes spending better or spending more wisely. So you can look at your total envelope and then make a decision, well, I'd like to spend more on X rather than Y. So you can decide your priorities without expanding the overall budgetary envelope. So, you know, in health, for example, you know, spending on the ounce of prevention more than on the curative side will ultimately lead to less spending down the road. So, you know, non-communicable diseases is a huge agenda here in Malaysia. So more can be done.
Everybody and their grandmother has diabetes, right?
Diabetes, you know, the chronic diseases of heart disease, hypertension, cancers, even road injury, you know, all the road traffic accidents. So more can be done there, effective policy making, to prevent what we see is spent, you know, later. And as you said, diabetes, you know, most of the costs come from the complications that can be prevented. There's also the mega trend of population aging, and with more and more elderly becoming, you know, the percentage of elderly becoming greater in society, the more social spending you will see. And that's why prevention comes in as a very important policy to promote. But, you know, going back to the poverty question, you know, we have been arguing that maybe the benefits of the current social assistance program, BSH, should be deepened. But that doesn't necessarily mean, you know, more money. It could be taking more from what you're doing here and putting it in there. So there are trade-offs and different policy objectives that the government can think of.
Taking a hard left into this conversation, the levels of corruption, or the corruption perception index, we have improved slightly on year, one place from 2017 to 2018. Some expect the new numbers to come up and perhaps be better than that. Do you think that corruption plays an important role in the development of this country?
Well, corruption is a very corrosive practice, and it really impedes development in all countries of the world. It's an agenda that we have adopted over the last 20 years as a development institution to focus on anti-corruption policies and what effective mechanisms could be put in place. So we have been engaged with the government and looking at the different policies after the last election and what can be done. So there is this new governance center, you know, the Center for Governance, I think, Ethics and Integrity. So it is focusing on different measures, and the government did roll out this new strategy. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
This new strategy for anti-corruption efforts. So it is doing the right kind of things, and now everybody should monitor what the outcomes are.
Of course, the larger macro trend is the youth 18 vote. Now most Malaysians can now vote. There's going to be 9 new voters coming into the picture in the upcoming election, well, not upcoming, but in the next general election, expected to be anywhere between 2022 to 2023. Does it change or influence the government into making policies a little bit more youth-centric?
Yeah, it should. I think the youth are the future of tomorrow.
Oh,
I mean, they are the faces of tomorrow. So they.
Cat Stevens said that.
Yeah,
yes.
they will have to focus on things that appeal to the youth, and that's the primary thing are jobs. So they will have to try to create jobs, and jobs comes from investments, the regulatory framework, the doing, you know, business environment. So
people vote with their stomach all the time, Dr. Firas.
Sure, and that's why it's important to try to promote the economic growth agenda and more importantly the job creation agenda. So you can have growth, but if you have high growth without enough job creation, it's not as meaningful.
Okay. Final words as we close this conversation. You came here, I think last year, if I'm mistaken. Am I right?
Yeah, I can't remember if I did or not.
Yeah. And having been in this place for a year now, what are your general observations of Malaysia as a whole?
So as I said in the beginning, I have been very impressed with this country. I've worked in other regions of the world. When I came to Southeast Asia, I saw a country or saw a region that is growing very fast, and it has delivered in many ways for the people of this region, improving the political and economic systems. And Malaysia is part of that story. It's, you know, part of this, the miracle of Southeast Asia. And the kinds of problems that we saw in our region after independence, the difficulties of post-colonialism, I think Malaysia was able to transcend these difficulties and build a modern state and modernize its economy and its institutions, and really grew you know, the national income level. And now it's at a stage where it's going to go to the next phase to hopefully you know, the high income and developed country status. And that is a big milestone. And as I said, it will take a lot to make sure that that threshold is crossed with the right foundations in place, so all Malaysians feel that they are benefiting from this economic prosperity.
Yeah, hence the shared prosperity notion that's coming up.
Yes, for sure.
All right, that was my conversation with the country head of the World Bank here in Malaysia, Dr. Firas Raad. If you've missed any part of this interview, just head on to astroawani.com, look for Notepad. These interviews are located there. You can also watch this interview live streaming on your devices. Just download the Astro AWANI app on your mobile devices, wherever you get the application. Once again, Selamat Hari Malaysia, and I wish you all the best. I'm sure that Malaysia has many, many more better days to come in the years ahead. Again, thank you very much and goodbye. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.